Welcome to all of you. My name is Miroslav Wolf, and I'm the director of Yale Center for Faith and Culture. And under the auspices of Yale Center for Faith and Culture is that we have organized this series of lectures entitled Theology Live. And we are asking the question of the relationship between faith and larger issues that are facing us today. How do we bring the faith to bear on issues outside of the walls of the church, outside of the walls of the offices of theologians, and the like. And we have a series of distinguished guests who are addressing us on this issue. And to introduce our guest today, I will invite David Miller, the Executive Director of Yale Center for Faith and Culture, and a former student in one of his lives of our distinguished guest. David, please come.
Well, welcome everybody to Theology Live, as Miroslav just said, and Bob, a personal welcome to you. Most of you will know Robert Wuthnow and his many books very well. As we were thinking which figures, which leading intellectuals and public thinkers to bring to come and talk to us about this, Bob's name came quickly to mind. We sent him a letter, an invitation letter, with the following question in it. We said, would you be willing to answer this following question, among others? How do you, in your capacity as a sociologist of religion and as a public intellectual, engage and shape the public conversation? Key phrase, engage and shape the public conversation with the resources of your faith, thinking through both the possibilities and the obstacles. For those of you who don't know, Professor Wuthnow is the Gerhard R. Andlinger Professor of Sociology and the Director of the Center for Study of Religion at Princeton University. He teaches sociology of religion and cultural sociology, specializing in the use of both quantitative and qualitative research methods. Bob has interests in a variety of areas with sociology of religion, civil society, nonprofit organizations, cultural sociology, social theory, and aspects of political and economic sociology. He's also interested in things as varied from small groups to music. One of the things in tracking Bob and being one of his students is to keep track with what he's most recently written. He is a prolific writer and always has a way of capturing not just descriptive tones, but also insights to interpret them and hints of prescriptive thoughts. Books recently written by him: Saving America, Faith-Based Services, and the Future of Civil Society, America and the Challenge of Religious Diversity, Loose Connections, Joining Together America's Fragmented Communities, Creative Spirituality, The Way of the Artist, and After Heaven, Spirituality in America since the 1950s. I was privileged to study under Bob while I was doing my graduate work at Princeton Theological Seminary. One of the highlights was something that we just loosely called the Friday afternoon seminars, where Bob gathered a collection of graduate students, postdocs, and visiting scholars, in which we presented papers and talked. In a way, we were doing Theology Live within the Academy. It's a joy to welcome Bob here personally and professionally to hear about how we might do Theology Live outside the Academy. With that, let's give Bob a warm welcome. Just as a note, when we're done, Bob will take some questions and we'll have a chance to have a conversation. So.
Well, thank you, David. Thanks for the warm introduction. I'm very glad to have this opportunity to be here with you. What I have prepared for my lecture today is more of a personal reflection than anything else, but I hope responsive to the question that David mentioned, having sent me to think about. I've titled this talk, Hanging in the Balance, Sociology and Theology. And I want to begin by quoting several lines from a popular song that go like this. I hear the ancient footsteps like the motion of the sea. Sometimes I turn, there's someone there. Other times, it's only me. I am hanging in the balance of the reality of man, like every sparrow falling, like every grain of sand. These are the closing lines of a song written by Bob Dylan in 1981. What do they have to do with theology? or with bringing theology into the public arena. The ancient footsteps, hanging in the balance, sparrow falling, grain of sand, all are images rich with biblical connotations. They speak to the frailty of life, the uncertainties inherent in faith, and the security that is often born of faith. There's a 1995 version of these lines sung by Emmylou Harris that I like even better. It concludes, "I am hanging in the balance of a perfect finished plan, like every sparrow falling, like every grain of sand." But what do lyrics like these have to do with sociology or with us here today? I've been asked to say something about what it means to work as a sociologist and about what is sometimes called a public intellectual and how theology may fit into this kind of enterprise. This is a humbling assignment. I do not often think of myself as a sociologist, even though that is the discipline in which I was trained and the department in which I work. If I am a sociologist, I'm not a very committed one, if I am honest about it, because the disciplinary boundaries sit loosely with me. I write more often to readers outside my discipline than inside it, and I direct a center that claims as its purpose the transgression of disciplinary lines. Nor do I feel particularly comfortable with the label of public intellectual. I think of public intellectuals as scholars who know a lot about important topics and spend their time giving congressional testimony. Thanks. And I think of them as people who speak to large audiences about important topics and often writing for popular journals and even for newspapers. I've done very little of that. I am at best a private intellectual, a person who prefers solitude rather than celebrity, who stays at home as much of the time as possible, and who enjoys research, hoping it will be read, but not caring very much if it is not. Nor can I claim to know much about theology, or for that matter, to be guided very explicitly or consciously by it. My theological training, if it can be called that, came mostly in Presbyterian and Baptist church basements as a child, and then later through reading on my own in the quiet of seminary libraries, when I probably should have been reading the journals of my appointed discipline. Yet, in the time of my confession, as Bob Dylan's song begins, in the hour of my deepest need, I wonder precisely about the question before us. How does a sociologist relate to theology? Or how is it that lived theology enters the picture, if it enters at all? How can scholars for whom faith is important serve the needs of the wider public? Well, I can think of four possibilities, each with some resonance in my own experience, and each with, I hope, enough generality that it may be useful to consider them in a forum such as this one. The first is what I call the lived theology of our individual and collective humanity. Sociology is a way of relating to our humanity. I believe we need to understand that and affirm that, whether we are social scientists or theologians. Some sociologists have taken a rather different approach to the relationship between sociology and theology. Believing that theology is primarily about God, they have tried to imagine what a God-centered sociology would look like, and especially how it might be different from a humanistic one. They have argued, for instance, that Marxist approaches would not qualify because Marxism has no place for God. They favor theories in which human agency has a larger place than social structure because they believe in free will. And so on and so on. In other words, their view is that social science cannot adequately speak of faith unless it is explicitly informed by faith and is thus distinctive. My view is rather different. I want a good physicist to respect and try to understand the physical universe. I want a good doctor to understand human physiology and anatomy. I I want a good sociologist to understand social interaction and society. If these realities are understood as a created order, if they are understood as reality that is sacred, in the broadest sense of that word, then the obligation of the researcher is to be true to them and to pay attention to the truth within them. That is the first consideration in bringing responsible voices into the public arena. We can take this observation a step further. To me, the idea of theology live, of lived theology, is a call for greater appreciation of what some refer to as theological anthropology. I have enough discipline, or enough loyalty to my own discipline, that it might be better to call it theological sociology than anthropology, but I know what the term means. It means having appreciation of the human, an appreciation that is sometimes expressed in philosophical questions, such as what is the balance between individual freedom and determinism? What is the relationship between spirit and body? How is that relationship gendered? And how are self-interest and the greater good reconciled? It is worthy to ponder these questions philosophically, yet it is also important to grapple with them holistically. That is, in ways that touch us intuitively and emotionally as well as intellectually. For instance, we respect Dietrich Bonhoeffer as a theologian because of what he experienced at the hands of the Nazis. We respect Mother Teresa's teachings because of her practices. Neither was mainly interested in being a public intellectual. Both were engaged with the fullness and the emptiness of lived experience. In ordinary life, ordinary people experience the depths of their humanity in an extraordinary variety of ways. In the fears of our own mortality and the mortality of our loved ones, to the pain we observe in doing volunteer work, or even in reading the morning newspaper. We experience the frailty of human life. And in the laughter of children and the embraces of friends, we experience its joy. We have a remarkable capacity, though, to insulate ourselves from that which we do not want to experience. Especially in Middle America, it is easy from just day-to-day life to remain oblivious, to comfortably watch television that purports to be reality, but often is not, and to devote our hours to acquiring what we do not need. Calling attention to that which we would just as soon ignore, engaging in the debunking of everyday assumptions, as Peter Berger once wrote, should be high on the agenda of social research. A few years ago at the annual convention of the American Sociological Association, a distinguished sociologist who was being honored for having written the book that received the award for the Distinguished Book of the Year, declared in his brief acceptance speech, "God, I love sociology." Well, he broke visibly into tears at that moment. I've never felt anything like that degree of emotion towards sociology. But one thing about sociology that does make me proud is the extent to which its practitioners focus on social problems. In the more than 3 decades that I have been associating with faculty and students in sociology, I have met no more than a handful who are attracted to the field in hopes of discovering scientific laws of human behavior. Nearly everyone is drawn to it because they want to understand some aspect of society that is problematic, that involves inequality or injustice, that was a failing of the past from which we can learn, or perhaps an accomplishment from which we could also learn. And sociologists do this in different ways. In my own department, for instance, one of my colleagues, Mitchell Denier, spent a number of years mingling with the homeless and street vendors in New York City. His book, Sidewalk, tells their story. or more accurately, lets them tell their story. His research is an example of ethnography at its very best. Getting to know people, getting inside their heads and their hearts, seeing the world through their eyes. Another colleague, Catherine Newman, has used ethnography to understand the lives of welfare mothers, and most recently, the lives of high school shooters and their victims. Sarah McClanahan, another colleague, uses quite different methods. Trained as a demographer, she adroitly uses surveys and statistical analysis. For the past 10 years, she has been studying what she calls fragile families, families where the biological father is absent, to learn what the mothers, fathers, and children are like, what they value, and what they need. Others in my department, such as Alejandro Portes and Marta Tienda, use quantitative methods to study immigrants and the children of immigrants and to understand why some succeed in school and others do not. Still others, such as Paul Starr, who wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book about the history of medicine, focus on the past to illuminate ways in which present-day policies, such as health policy, could be more effective. Herbert Gans, a sociologist who taught at Columbia for many years, compiled a list a few years ago of the 50 best-selling books written by sociologists. Some of these titles are household phrases, others are more obscure, but the titles themselves are evocative. The Lonely Crowd, Pursuit of Loneliness, Blaming the Victim, Worlds of Pain, Hidden Injuries of Class, War Games, Outsiders, and so on. Hearing these titles, I am reminded of another stanza of Bob Dylan's song. It goes like this: "Oh, the flowers of indulgence and the weeds of yesteryear, like criminals, they have choked the breath of conscience and good cheer. The sun beat down upon the steps of time to light the way, to ease the pain of idleness and the memory of decay." Is the sun here a reference to God or perhaps to Christ? Should a sociologist interested in the heartache of human experience bring religion into the picture? Is that how theology becomes relevant? There was a time when I would have said yes, and part of me still wants to say yes. However, most of me says no. Being true to the task of seeking truth is enough. In at least some quarters, this is the counsel of theology itself. Listen to what Jean-Pierre de Caussade, the 18th century Jesuit, has to say on this matter. This is a quote: "Every current, every technique thrusts us onward in our voyage to the infinite. Everything works to this end, and without exception, helps us toward holiness. We can find all that is necessary in the present moment. We need not worry about whether to pray or be silent, whether to withdraw into retreat or mix with people, to read or write, to meditate or make our minds a receptive blank, to shun or seek out books. What does matter is what each moment produces by the will of God." And I read de Caussade to be saying that the experience of human life is already holy. We may want to become more aware of that holiness, but that may occur as much by acknowledging its mystery as by bringing in a particular religious perspective. This is not to deny the value of moments of introspection and self-examination, only to suggest that those are time-outs from the work of scholarship rather than scholarship itself. Listen to what Mark Knoll, a historian who surely values a distinct Christian perspective as much as any living historian does, writes about his own understanding of doing history. He says, "Only on unusual occasions calling for more particular self-reflection does it seem necessary to tease more out of what usually remain background convictions. I am probably typical as a historian in that I do not think about higher-level questions of theory and practice as often as I do about questions related to plausible explanations for specific historical events and circumstances. And Noel goes on to remind us that we as scholars, like the subjects we study, are human and are thus connected to our subject matter in a larger totality. I merely wish to underscore the value of the subject matter itself, the complexity of the human experience. The second way in which sociology and lived theology come together is through the residue of our cultural experience. The residue of our cultural experience. We live in a culture that has been historically Christian and that in many ways remains so even today, referring to those of us here in the United States. I have no doubt at all that I would not be a Christian had I grown up in a society that was predominantly Muslim, Hindu, or Buddhist. Having studied other religions and other societies, I have had no impulse to convert. Sociology teaches the deep extent to which all beliefs are embedded in their cultural contexts. The meanings of belief are inscribed in those contexts. Yet, sociology also encourages us to see those contexts by stepping outside of them and viewing our own context from a comparative perspective. Sociology serves the public in this way by making the familiar strange. Some practitioners do this more than others. Having worked mostly on the United States, I have done so relatively little. But comparative perspectives in the social sciences are inescapable. One of the central debates in the sociology of religion in recent years concerns the impact of exposure to and competition among diverse belief systems and cultural traditions. Under the unabashedly pretentious rubric of a new paradigm, sociologists with an economistic bent have declared that such competition among diverse beliefs is good for religion, just as free markets are good for capitalism. In this view, belief has already been thoroughly relativized. It hinges not on convictions about truth, but on church suppers and youth programs. Methodists work harder when there are Baptists down the block that are doing the same thing. And not surprisingly, this view has been advanced by writers who themselves do not take theology very seriously. In their view, religion is a kind of game, of interest mostly as we try to predict who wins and who loses. And the news media are naturally attracted. What could be more interesting, they say, than a game of winners and losers? Well, proponents of this new paradigm imagine that there was an old paradigm in which competition between Methodists and Baptists was somehow supposed to undermine the vitality of both. Had these proponents read more carefully, they would know this was not what other scholars suggested at all. The opposing argument is rather that stepping out of one's taken for granted reality necessarily alters the way in which you view your own reality. It was not an argument about predicting how much a decline the Gallup poll might register in church attendance in the 1990s. It was concerned more with the shift in perceptions that came about as people were exposed to fundamentally incommensurate belief systems. Exposure not of Methodist to Baptist, but of tribal peoples to Western colonizers, or Christian exclusivists to other world religions. The prediction was not that such exposure would completely undermine the credibility of earlier beliefs, but that beliefs chosen would be qualitatively different from beliefs inherited. Different, as Paul Ricoeur characterized them, in having shifted from one of primary naivete to one of secondary naivete. The news media have had trouble understanding this sort of argument. What we are learning from research is that the old paradigm, if it can be called that, still tells us more about the lived theologies of ordinary people than the new one does. Hardly any of the Christians living in the United States are unaware of the existence of other religions in other parts of the world or even in our own society. To be sure, some are more aware than others. Some Americans, for instance, have dabbled in Buddhism, or their son or daughter has married a Muslim, or they have worked with Hindus, or traveled abroad. Even the most sheltered American Christians, though, live in a world of religious and cultural diversity. they adjust their beliefs and practices accordingly. For instance, a large majority of Americans believe that the United States was founded on Christian principles and remains still a Christian society. They go so far as insisting that the Ten Commandments should be taught in public schools. They nevertheless believe that other religions contain some truth, that other religions, for that matter, may be good ways of knowing God, and at any rate should be respected and granted the right to worship freely. They might wish Christianity were the official religion of the United States, but few are willing to do much to make that happen. As one fundamentalist pastor discovered recently in calling for born-again Christians to move to South Carolina, declare it a Christian nation, and withdraw from the rest of the United States. Not many people followed his advice. In other ways, the quality of belief is shaped by diversity. Most evangelical Christians believe they should share their faith, and a majority believe they should try to make converts, but hardly any ever do so by talking to Muslims or Hindus. More inclusive Christians believe they should learn about other faiths and sponsor interreligious programs, yet hardly any do that. It's easier to be Christian without knowing much about other religions. The trouble with likening religion, though, to come back to the new paradigm argument, to likening religion to a market in which suppliers compete to be winners or losers, is that it misses the very processes by which people make sense of their worlds. This was why Max Weber, responding a century ago to the economistic thinking of his era, insisted on paying attention to the meanings of social behavior. And to return to my point about culture, in the hundreds of qualitative interviews I have conducted, I find that everyone makes comparisons in order to make sense of his or her own behavior, including his or her religious behavior. In real life, theology is all about comparisons. Stories of religious conversion are narratives that contrast usually a bad past with a better present. Stories of spiritual journeys literally employ spatial metaphors to compare where a person started with where a person is now. Evangelicals would not be the same without the comparisons they make to non-evangelicals. And liberal Christians would not be the same without comparing themselves with evangelicals. This is how we understand America. America is good, we tell ourselves, because of our faith in God, because God is on our side, and we are on the side of freedom. Other countries, we tell ourselves, aren't so good. Well, as scholars, we need to probe the depths of these taken for granted and often self-legitimating narratives. Families, too, make for frequent comparisons. For instance, we understand the prodigal son in comparison with the older brother. We understand our own journey by contrasting ourselves with our father or our mother, or by remembering the faith of a grandparent. This brings me to my third point, which has to do with upbringing. Sociologists have long been interested in the family and the effects of family values on subsequent behavior. In recent years, family values have themselves become a contested topic in the public square. Often the discussions do little more than justify competing lifestyles. But there is ample grist in this literature for reflections about theology as well. Social theorists from Hegel and Marx to Weber, and more recent writers such as Lloyd Warner and Guy E. Swanson, have argued that there are affinities between the authority structure one experiences in the family, that is your family of origin, and the ways in which he or she intuitively perceives the family of God, including the Trinity, the Holy Mother, angels, and the saints. In his book, Moral Politics, the linguistic anthropologist George Lakoff has recently argued that the differences in outlooks between religious conservatives and religious liberals, as well, he thinks, as between political conservatives and liberals, can largely be understood in terms of two dominant metaphors about the family. He calls one the strict father metaphor and the other the nurturing parent metaphor. Lakoff summarizes strict father theology this way: Being made of flesh, I'm quoting Lakoff now, being made of flesh, human beings are morally weak. This inherent moral weakness is called original sin, as exemplified by the moral weakness of Adam and Eve, which resulted in God's taking everlasting life away from human beings. But God loved human beings so much, he wanted to give them a way out. So he made his only Son a human being who was free of sin, and hence had no moral debits. Through his crucifixion, Jesus paid off mankind's original sin debit. Jesus offered sinners a deal. If they would truly repent, accept him as their Lord, join his church, and follow his teachings for the rest of their lives, he would pay off their moral debts and wipe their slate clean. There's more in Lakoff's description, but you get the picture, and I'm sure it's familiar. Theology, even though condensed here, is familiar. Lakoff argues that the prominence of this theology in conservative churches goes hand in hand with believing that the moral universe is scary, corruption is incipient, and one must follow strict rules and be strict with one's children in order to be a good person. So it all makes sense. It hangs together. In contrast, the nurturant-parent model, he says, emphasizes grace. Lakoff summarizes it in the following 5 propositions. God is a nurturant parent to human beings. Christ is the bearer of God's nurturance to human beings. God's grace is nurturance. Moral action is nurturant action, such as demonstrating compassion. Immoral action, or sin, is non-nurturant action toward others. Lakoff says this understanding of Christian teaching is grounded in having loving parents who give love unconditionally and from whom one learns about growth, healing, and caring for others. So here in the figure of George Lakoff is a social scientist giving us insights about the very language in which political discourse is framed. And in my view, Lakoff's approach is much more helpful for understanding why theology works the way it does in real life than the market model of the new paradigm is. One reason is simply that Lakoff recognizes a metaphor when he sees one, whereas the market modelers are so enraptured with theirs that they fail to see it for what it is. I'm not suggesting that Lakoff is necessarily correct in his depiction of the 2 ways in which he thinks Christianity is popularly understood. In my research, I find, for instance, that conservative Christians are often more complex than Lakoff characterizes them. They are often more individualistic in asserting their freedom than subservience to a strict father would suggest. And as Brad Wilcox has recently shown, the strict fathers in conservatively religious families are often more nurturing and more expressive toward their spouses and children than fathers in other families are. The important point, it seems to me, is that we do use metaphors and images and stories to make sense of theology in real life. And in doing so, we draw heavily on our family experiences. I believe these family experiences and the stories that result go part way in helping us understand how theology mixes with the actual work of doing sociology. One hallmark of the social sciences is to couch research in an epistemology of generalities. A recent study by Harvard sociologist Michel Lamont and several colleagues of decisions by government funding agencies shows that projects are more likely to be funded if they adopt an epistemology of generalities than if people write from their idiosyncratic perspectives. Conversations with social scientists, though, suggest that the idiosyncrasies of personal backgrounds often guide their research to a great extent. Immigrants study immigrants, single mothers study single mothers, and so on. If we are to understand the public role of social scientists, if we are interested in furthering that project and linking it with faith, we clearly must go then behind the scenes, behind the public utterances, and into the private realm, into the family even, where these fundamental convictions are shaped. I believe that's some of what this series is intended to do. So in my own case, early childhood experiences I have come to realize, provide the single best explanation for my lifelong interest in trying to understand social change. I grew up on a small farm in the middle of Kansas. I loved the farm, went to church in the community, and loved the community. I expected to grow up and live in that community. But the county in which I grew up was one of the poorest in the state. And during the time I lived there, more farms went out of business than had during the Great Depression. My father died when I was 18. And that summer, as I mourned his death and plowed his fields for the last time, I declared to myself that this was the end of an era, just as the era of horse-drawn farming had ended a generation earlier when my grandfather died. I moved on, struggled through college, not knowing which way to turn, got married, gravitated toward the social sciences because it was something I felt I could do, and wound up as a graduate student in Berkeley at the height of the student unrest. I was not interested in sociology of religion at the time, but I took a course in it from a professor named Charles Bloch. The only thing I remember from the course was a sloping line he drew on the chalkboard one day. I don't now remember whether the line sloped up or down, but it represented social change. Bloch was convinced that we were living in a time of significant social change, and having recently driven from Kansas to Berkeley, I could appreciate his point. Well, the connection of all of this to theology, as I explained to another audience one time, is best expressed in an image Madeleine L'Engle has used. She writes of going out to a quiet place at night and looking up at the stars. When she does this, she sometimes hears music, the music of the universe, the music of God, she says. I go back to Kansas once in a while to see what remains of the life I left behind. I go to the town where the Baptist church I attended as a child once stood. There's a small marker saying the church was torn down in 1978. I stop at the place where our farm buildings once stood, where my father came home from World War II, not in good health, and renovated an old ramshackle house, put a new roof on the barn, and planted a shelter belt of trees. Down in the ditch, under a clump of dead sunflowers, I find a small roll of rusted barbed wire. It is all that remains. I feel like a displaced person, a refugee. Like Madeleine L'Engle, I sometimes imagine the music of the universe, but for me it is music in a minor key. Bob Dylan's song includes these words: I have gone from rags to riches in the sorrow of the night, in the violence of a summer's dream, in the chill of a wintry light, in the bitter dance of loneliness, fading into space, in the broken mirror of innocence on each forgotten face. Well, the fourth and final connection I want to make between sociology and theology concerns the peculiarities of vocation, or calling, or what in less religiously nuanced language we refer to simply as work. Thanks to the profound influence of Max Weber on sociology, no sociologist is unaware of Weber's arguments about the calling and the role of the Protestant Reformation in popularizing a new understanding of the calling. In this new understanding, work in the professions, whether in science or medicine or politics, came to have divine significance, just as the work of priests and monastics had previously. All activity matters. All work becomes a means of glorifying God. I am not the one, especially in this gathering, to offer any insights into the theology of work, but I do want to offer something more modest that grows from my own experience. The reason I am sometimes called on to talk or to write about sociology and theology is mostly that I specialize in sociology of religion. I do think that raises some special considerations. A quick disclaimer first, though. There is no particular reason why only sociologists of religion should deal with the relationship between sociology and theology, or why their work should not be an expression of faith. Among the sociologists in my department again, one is an elder and sings in the choir at his church. Another goes to the same church and does volunteer work at a prison. Still another goes to church and has on occasion given prayers at university convocations. I imagine that they have thought plenty about theology, but because they study other things, they would not be high on the list of speakers about sociology and theology. Casting the net more widely, John Schmalzbauer writes in his book, People of Faith, that evangelicals and Catholics who work in the social sciences and in journalism adopt a wide variety of strategies for relating their personal faith convictions to their work. A few, like Andrew Greeley, for instance, who writes as a priest as well as a sociologist, are quite explicit about the connections. But most are like E.J. Dionne or Cokie Roberts, for whom theology is important but remains hidden. In contrast, sociologists of religion find it harder to hide their theological convictions, although some do. My view is that sociologists of religion should be candid in disclosing their convictions insofar as these convictions bear on their interpretation of the subject matter of their teaching and research. For instance, in teaching in the typical university setting, where students are likely to come from a wide variety of religious backgrounds, I believe an instructor has an obligation to explain that he or she was raised in a particular religious tradition and thus has knowledge of it that he or she probably does not have about other traditions. The same is probably true when scholars write books. Is it not appropriate to include such disclosures in one's preface or introduction? A writer or an instructor may need to go further. For instance, saying that he or she still adheres to that religious tradition or has abandoned it. But to go much further seems unnecessary to me, and indeed runs danger of violating what Max Weber wrote about so usefully in his essay, Science as a Vocation, in which he cautioned against professors abusing their authority by mixing personal convictions with theoretical perspectives and empirical materials. I hasten to add, though, that this consideration does not prohibit sociologists from advocating normative positions. Much of sociology is fundamentally concerned with normative issues. It makes assumptions, for instance, about discrimination or about child abuse being bad. And it often advances policy recommendations geared toward alleviating those problems. Sociologists of religion should be no less inhibited in drawing conclusions in their research about ways in which religion may be beneficial or harmful, or ways in which religious organizations, for that matter, could be more effective than they currently are in doing their work. These public occasions in teaching or writing in which disclosing something about one's theological convictions become appropriate leave out a great deal, of course. These are the more personal ways in which one's convictions guide one's life and thus shape one's work. I want to close with a comment about those. One hears from time to time a comment to the effect that, well, if God didn't exist, nothing would be meaningful. I've tried on numerous occasions to imagine what a statement like that might mean, and to do so by imagining that God does not exist, which is not hard for me, I have to admit, because unlike some people, I have never heard God speak to me or experienced some emotion that made me certain about God's existence. For all I know, and I use the word advisedly, for all I know, God may not exist. And yet, when I imagine living in a world in which God does not exist, nothing much is different. I am still completely dumbfounded by the complexity of the human eye. I am in awe that the sky is blue and that the earth rotates and the wind blows, but usually does not blow us away. I still feel an overwhelming urge to live my days as responsibly as I can. And the conclusion I draw is not, therefore, that God really does not exist, but that I fundamentally lack the imagination it would take to understand what that might mean. For I have absorbed so deeply the primordial lessons of my childhood that even the world I imagine in which God does not exist is one in which something very much like God does still exist. Those are what Robert Bellah on one occasion referred to as the ground base of our convictions as a culture about God. Sociology helps me understand some of why these convictions are so powerful. But they are also mysteries that go well beyond sociology. This is why in some of my work I have turned to artists and musicians, listening to them and learning their theological wisdom. For theirs is not only a language that describes, but also a language that reminds us of the spaces between our descriptions. And thus I close with another stanza from Bob Dylan. I gaze into the doorway of temptation's angry flame, and every time I pass that way, I always hear my name. Then onward in my journey, I come to understand that every hair is numbered like every grain of sand. Thank you.